Very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. So again, yesterday I was really very busy, so I couldn't come out with a video. So today we will be covering today's newspaper, yesterday's newspaper, and day before yesterday's one topic that I had told I will be discussing yesterday, that was on Gilgit-Baltistan. So that also we will be discussing today. So all that we'll be covering today. Video is going to be a little longer, so make sure that you have patience to go through the entire video, but because it's going to cover 2.5 days of newspapers. So let's start with the topics. The first topic we are going to be discussing is related to issues of education. So education and its issues are a part of your GS syllabus too. So in these two editorials, the main crux was about what impact this pandemic has had on the education of children, particularly because the schools were shut down and the mode of learning shifted from being the one that was taught in the classrooms, that is an offline mode, to the one that is now centered on the virtual mode through online classes. So how this shift from offline to online has had an impact on the educational outcomes for children is the focus of this editorial. Now this emphasis on what has been the impact on the children is brought by a report by NGO Pratham. So Pratham NGO publishes a report annually, which is the annual status of education report. So this annual status of education report 2020 has been now published, and this talks about how the pandemic has impacted the learning upon children. So first of all, let's have a look at this. So first it says that the digital connectivity has become very important in today's era. So in the scenario of a pandemic, to access online study classes, study materials, digital connectivity has become very important. So it says that 44% of children who are in the government schools have said that they have no smartphones to access their online classes. So nearly 44% of students from the government institutions have no smartphones with them to access their online classes. 67% of these students from these government institutions who got any kind of learning material or study material from their schools got it through WhatsApp. So the first data is 44% of children from the government schools have no smartphones with them to access any online learning material. And 67% of students who were surveyed under the ASER report said that whatever learning material they got from schools, they got it through WhatsApp. And only 11% of the students who were surveyed said that they were able to have access to any kind of online classes or online learning. So this shows how the students have become a lot more dependent on digital connectivity. Having access to a smartphone and having access to good internet connectivity has become the basic requirement for getting any educational attainment in the era of the pandemic. So this shows first of all the importance of digital connectivity, which needs to be increased and expanded. And second, it shows how the pandemic has an overwhelming impact on the students because it has impacted their learning outcomes. It has disrupted the education of a lot of students who don't have access to smartphones and internet connectivity. So this is what this report is highlighting, that we need to make our educational system more accessible and it should reach and more inclusive to all people. It should reach a variety of students whether or not they have access to digital ways of connecting and accessing the learning materials. The second important thing that we have to note about this is this ASER report is brought out by the NGO Pratham. So Pratham NGO is very popular in the field of providing quality and affordable education to especially the underprivileged students in the country. So for that, it takes up a lot of programs. For example, in some of these underprivileged areas like the slums and all, it provides free support to learning for the children from these slums. It also publishes and distributes a lot of free or very affordable textbooks and materials for these underprivileged children. So NGO Pratham does a lot of these kinds of work, and also it has always been working towards improving the educational attainment in the schools. So how to improve the learning outcomes has always been something that NGO Pratham has strived for. So in this regard, it has actually come out with some new measures which could be incorporated to improve the learning outcomes. For example, grouping children based on their levels, that is based on what their already attained educational level is, and based on their needs, what do they need. So what are their intellectual needs at that point of time, how much intellectual maturity they have at a point of time. So based on that, the children are going to be grouped into a particular class and not on the basis of age. So this was one idea that was promoted by Pratham in order to improve the learning outcomes. And also, so this you can quote whenever you are talking about NGO Pratham, or some such philanthropic organizations which are doing some great work towards educational improvements in the country. And also you have a topic in your GS2 syllabus that talks specifically about the civil society organizations, NGOs and all. Previously on ICANN also, we have discussed a lot of examples on the NGOs and the kind of work they are doing. We have taken a full-fledged question on the role of NGOs in the policy cycle in India. So in that we have said, we have taken few examples of NGOs which have contributed in policy formulation, few examples of NGO which have contributed in policy implementation, and again few NGOs which have contributed in policy evaluation and feedback, and so on and so forth. So in this case, Pratham NGO is coming out with this ASAR report that is kind of a reflection of how good our educational policies have been. So though ASAR reports have time and again pointed out that even though the educational, the enrollment has improved over a period of time, but the outcomes, the educational outcomes or the learning outcomes in India are generally very poor. So it has time and again kept saying how a child belonging to class 2 finds it very difficult to child belonging to class 5 finds it very difficult to read a textbook of class 2, and how a child belonging to class 8 fails to do some simple arithmetic computations. So this shows that even though enrollment in India is increasing, but the corresponding learning outcomes has not improved in India. So this study and this report by Pratham through ASAR reports every year, so that is a kind of a document that can help us to improve upon our educational policies. And it also provides a feedback to us about how our educational policies are performing and how they are being implemented, and what changes we may have to incorporate in the future. So this way NGO Pratham is also contributing in the entire policy cycle. So this example also you can quote when you're writing about your NGO related answers. So now let's move on to the next topic. The next topic we'll be discussing is about India and United States relations, which is a part of your GS2 syllabus. So in the last video on ICANN, we discussed about the signing of BECA between India and United States, which was the last of the foundational agreements that was signed between India and US. So this has given rise to much more closer cooperation between the armed forces of both the countries. So basically this whole article was written by Rakesh Sood, who has been a former diplomat, and he says that India-US defense relations has always been on a roller coaster ride. That is, there have been several ups and there have also been several downs in our defense cooperation. So he basically, through this editorial, takes us through a journey of India-US defense relationships, talking about the various ups and the various lows. So let's have a look at this. So first he starts by talking about the 1991 Kicklighter proposals. So Claude Kicklighter was a United States Army commander at the US Pacific Command. So the Kicklighter proposals was the first such proposals that suggested that the armed forces of India and United States must have a much closer cooperation, and there must be much more exchanges between the armed forces of the two nations. So this was what the Kicklighter proposals talked about in 1991. So from here started, and this was also the time when the Indian economy was opening up through the LPG reforms. So that's why the Kicklighter proposals, on the one hand from the United States and Indian economy opening up to the outside world through the LPG reforms, on the other hand they were complementary in nature, and through this the India-US defense partnership started to grow. This was also the time when the Cold War had ended because of the disintegration of the USSR. So this again made India more close and more friendly towards the United States, and opening up the space for both the countries to engage in more cooperation and exchanges as far as the defense relations are concerned. But however, during those times, India had a very different threat perceptions which United States was not able to understand or completely comprehend. So India on the one hand had a rising China, and India had Pakistan on the other hand. So therefore India wanted to have established that deterrence within the country, due to which it undertook nuclear tests in 1998. But however, United States was completely against India undertaking any nuclear tests, for the reason being India was not a part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So it said that these India and such countries, no other country should actually have nuclear weapons, or nuclear tests should not be conducted. So US was furious when India conducted its nuclear tests, and it imposed a lot of economic sanctions on India. So this was a time when our relation in general and defense partnership in particular saw a low, where United States completely cut off from India and it imposed a lot of sanctions on India. So any defense cooperation that started to take place since 1991 also got suspended when we conducted the nuclear tests. However, at the political level between both the countries, a lot of negotiations were going on to lift the sanctions, and finally diplomacy won, and in the year 2005 the sanctions that US had imposed on India after India conducted nuclear tests were also removed, and in 2005 a framework agreement for defense cooperation was signed. So this framework agreement was a 10-year agreement that was signed between India and US, for which provides a framework for partnership in the defense sector. So as I said that this was a 10-year agreement, so this definitely lapsed in 2015, but then it was again extended for another 10-year till 2025. So as it was a framework agreement, it spoke about a lot of things, whether it was technology transfer between the defenses of both the countries, intelligence, exchange of intelligence, then more joint exercises to be carried out by the armed forces of both the countries, and also about humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So it includes a framework which comprised of all these different areas of cooperation in which the two countries did cooperate starting 2005. And in between that, when this cooperation was going on in 2008, India and United States signed a civil nuclear deal. So this again made the cooperation in the defense sector much more smoother, because United States now had less worries about exporting any nuclear material, or signing any nuclear deal with India for establishing some civilian nuclear reactors for generation of power and all that. So this again smoothened our defense relations between the two countries. And then in 2015, India and United States signed what is called as a joint strategic vision in the defense sector, and this later on became even more comprehensive and inclusive. And this joint strategic vision for Asia Pacific and the Indian Ocean region, it further became a comprehensive strategic partnership later on. So this was one more milestone in our defense cooperation. In 2016, India was designated by the United States as a major defense partner. So which means US was to give India a lot of importance compared to the other non-NATO countries. It was to give India a lot of importance when it comes to defense. So that is why it designated India as a major defense partner. And then in 2018, India was also put by the United States in category 1 of the Strategic Trade Authorization STA. So strategic trade authorization means that when any country is put under this category 1 of strategic trade authorization, it means that, as the name itself suggests, strategic trade authorization. So there are a lot of trading that happens which are over very sensitive technologies. So exchange of such sensitive technologies is authorized by this agreement, so which is strategic trade authorization, and India was put under category 1. So this eased the controls that were applicable before on exchange of any sensitive technologies between the two countries. So this was another important milestone that happened. So these were the important milestones when we talk of the India-US defense relationship. But you cannot completely cut off the defense relationship and view it as an isolated development from the rest of the other developments between the India and US. So that is from the rest of the how the relationships in various other fields developed between the two countries. So there were three important reasons that this article quotes why India-US defense relationships could flourish and could actually come from the various lows it saw to the various highs. So one of that was a bilateral trade. So the India-US bilateral trade improved drastically and very well. So that this again was a point that was always kept in the minds of both the countries. Because when some country is economically important to you, you cannot completely deny cooperating in the defense sector. So India-US economic and trade relations became so strong that defense automatically was given a lot of importance, and it just happened because that's the importance that you assign to the other country, because the other country is so important to you economically because of the strong trade ties that you have. So in 2000, the bilateral trade between the two countries was nearly $20 billion. But by 2018, it has already become $140 billion. So this shows how much important India was to the United States in terms of economy and trade. So that is why both the countries were also willing to cooperate in the defense sector. Similarly, another important such factor that has contributed to good relations was the presence of Indian diaspora in United States. So more than 4 million strong Indian diaspora is present in the United States, which has always lobbied for India's interest. For example, when sanctions were imposed on India, when India conducted nuclear tests, the diaspora actually lobbied with the United States government to remove these sanctions. So their contribution also mattered a lot in the development of relationships between India and United States. The third important factor was the defense acquisition. So defense acquisition, say in 2005, between both the countries was less than $400 million. But then now it has become so much that India and US have defense contracts worth more than $18 billion. So this was just 400 million, and now the defense contracts worth more than 800 billion are now in operation. So therefore this defense acquisition and cooperation also increased, and that is why the overall defense relationships between both the countries have been strong, even though it has seen several lows, but there have also been several highs in India-US defense partnership. So this was about the journey through which the India-US defense relationships have gone through right since 1991, and the other factors like India being an economically important country to the United States and the presence of diaspora also contributing towards further strengthening of the India-US defense relationship. So this was about the analysis of this article. Now we move on to the next topic. Finally, next topic we'll be seeing is about stubble burning. So stubble burning, as you know, has become an annual topic that's always in news when the winters come about in the Gangetic Plains, and where the farmers, particularly in Punjab and Haryana, start burning the stubble, that is the remains after they harvest their paddy crop. So this has given rise to a smoke blanket over the entire northern Indian region, and that comes even up to Delhi. So this has always given rise to an environmental issue and has several health repercussions as well. So it is a part of your GS3 syllabus that talks about environmental protection. So first of all, we need to understand the root cause of this problem. So let's see why this has become such a huge problem for us. This was not a problem before 1980s, because what happened before 1980s was people were plucking off or harvesting manually by plucking the plant from its root. So all the way the paddy plants were plucked from their roots, so that would just the entire thing would come out of the soil. And also sometimes the farmers would till back the paddy roots into the soil, so that improves the fertility of the soil. This was what the farmers were doing before. But after 1980s, the scenario was completely different, because we had green revolution by then, and because of green revolution, the farmers had shifted from various crops that were suiting their agroclimatic conditions towards wheat and paddy. So wheat and paddy had become the most dominant crops in the northern region after the Green Revolution became successful in the area. So more the amount of paddy and wheat production, more is the amount of stubble that is produced. Therefore, it led to even more problems regarding how the stubble is to be disposed. Apart from this, the Green Revolution also brought in some machinery and some mechanization in agriculture. So it introduced what is called as combined harvesting machines. So these combined harvesting machines, the way they harvest the paddy crop is they harvest it from the surface itself, and therefore nearly 1 foot tall stalk is left behind. So this stalk which is left behind has to be disposed of, and usually if this stalk has to decompose on the field, it will take nearly 45 to 50 days for decomposition of the stalk. But however, farmers have very less time left with them. After they harvest the paddy crop, they have nearly 25 days to be left, before which they have to plant their wheat crop. So in this less time, these paddy stalks are not going to decompose because they are going to take much more time to decompose. So they don't have any solution left with them but to start burning the stubble on their field. So this was the condition after 1980s. So therefore you can trace the root cause of this problem is about mechanization and using of these combined harvesting machines, which harvest from above the surface and they leave a stalk of 1 foot tall, which now cannot be decomposed on the field because they will have to now plant their wheat crop as well. So as far as this is concerned, now farmers as left with no other option, they have started to burn the stubble on their field itself. Led to a number of impacts. One of that, and the primary being the environmental impact. So definitely when stubble is burned, it is going to create or generate a lot of poisonous gases, including nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, and increase the presence of particulate matter in the environment. So these particulate matters are very porous, and they can just infuse from the lungs into the bloodstream, and they can cause a lot of respiratory issues and problems. The second is the TERI report, which is the Energy and Resources Institute of India report. So this produced a report in 2019 which said that the smoke blanket, because of this, that is created in the Indo-Gangetic plain, has led to air pollution, making the air at least 20 times which is more than the threshold that the WHO has prescribed. So air has these poisonous gases and particulate matters, which is 20 times more than the safe threshold as has been prescribed by the World Health Organization. So this is the environmental impact of burning the stubble. The second is the impact that stubble burning is having on the soil and its fertility. So stubble burning is first of all going to reduce the fertility of the soil. So when the soil is tilled back in, when the stubble is tilled back into the soil, it will create it will make the soil more fertile. It will develop a particular texture for the soil, which helps in retaining the moisture, so it becomes more fertile. But however, when the stubble is burnt, it is going to make the soil less fertile. The soil will be deprived of various organic content. The second is, burning the stubble is also going to reduce the groundwater levels. So there is nothing, no roots where these ground or water could percolate down to the earth. So therefore, burning of the stubble is also going to reduce the groundwater levels. So this is what is the impact on the. And the last is the impact on the health. So it is going to have a lot of impact on the human health. There have been, we saw last week how in the ICANN videos, how the global burden of disease report has said that air pollution has led to a number of premature deaths in India, infant deaths in India. So how it has led to the overall increased burden of non-communicable diseases in India. We saw a detailed report on that in the last week's ICANN video. So this air pollution and the smoke blanket because of stubble burning is leading to a lot of respiratory diseases, be it chronic lung infections or cardiovascular diseases and all that. So all of these, asthma, so various such respiratory diseases it is leading to. And particularly in the case of pandemic, wherein corona pandemic, people who are already having weak lungs are more vulnerable to this particular infection. So in such cases, when you also have such bad air quality, people will be more likely to succumb to such infections due to failure of their heart and breathing issues. So this is the impact that the stubble burning will have on health. Then this article also talks about the current status of how stubble burning is dealt with in India, or what are the possible, or what are the various at what various levels stubble burning is dealt with in India is also detailed in this article. First is the state government's role. So Punjab has already banned the burning of stubble in the state. Apart from this, the state governments have also been asked, and many of the state governments have now been providing subsidy to those machines which can help the farmers in handling the stubble. So they have been giving farmers subsidized or rented machines like happy seeders, etc., so that farmers can deal with this stubble. So this has been the role played by the state government. Even the National Green Tribunal has banned the burning of stubble in Punjab, Haryana, and the Delhi NCR in the northern region. NGT has already banned, even in Rajasthan, it has banned the burning of stubble. Under section 188 of the Indian Penal Code, again burning of the stubble is also an offence. Similarly, under Air Control and Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1981 also says that burning of the stubble contributes to air pollution, and therefore burning the stubble is an offence under this particular act as well. So in spite of all this, still the problem of stubble burning is persisting, and we need to do something about it. So in this regard, one important judgment that you have to mention is about the Aditya Dubey versus Union of India. So in Aditya Dubey versus Union of India, the Supreme Court said that there has to be a one-man committee that is going to monitor the condition of this whole problem, and is also going to suggest measures on how to overcome this problem. So it should monitor how much the pollution is there because of stubble burning, and also it will have to come out with measures to stop this practice. So after this judgment, this one-man committee under Justice Madan Lokur was set up. So the Madan Lokur committee was set up that was to monitor how much of stubble burning is happening, and what these directions of Supreme Court, NGT, and all that, whether they are followed or not, and also to suggest measures. Now the government is planning to come up with a permanent commission that is going to monitor this problem. So by replacing this one-man temporary commission that was set up by the Supreme Court, now the government is planning to come up with a permanent commission that is going to monitor the burning of stubble in the northern Indian region. So this important committee of Madan Lokur committee and the judgment of Aditya Dubey versus Union of India has to be quoted in your answer. So then this article also talks about some of the steps which have to be taken, which are also in fact are already being taken. So custom hiring centers have been opened, particularly in Punjab and Haryana. So as the name itself suggests, these are hiring centers from where the farmers can take on rent some of those machines which can help the farmers to deal with the stubble. So like happy seeders or rotavator, they are those machines that can help the farmers to deal with the stubble. So the custom hiring centers have been set up from where the farmers can actually rent these equipments and then get their job done, because harvesting paddy and the problem of stubble burning is usually an annual affair. It comes once in a year. So it will not be wise to suggest the farmers to buy that machine, because that is going to prove expensive for the farmers who are going to use it only once yearly. So therefore there are custom hiring centers from where the farmers can just rent these machines and then use them to deal with the stubble. So International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center has also done a study whereby it has shown that the use of these machines like happy seeder and rotavator and to dealing with the stubble has actually increased the productivity by 10 to 15% on the field, and it has also led to an increase in the soil fertility. The next important step that has been taken is a Pusa decomposer. So about this we have already discussed in one of our previous ICANN videos. So this decomposer has been built by the Pusa Indian Agriculture Research Institute. So what this Pusa decomposer does is it's basically a tablet. So this tablet contains strains of several fungi. So once this tablet is diluted in water and is sprayed over the stubble, this fungi starts to decompose this stubble. So usually, as I said, decomposition at normal rates takes about 45-50 days, but when the fungi is sprayed over the stubble, it increases the rate of decomposition of the stubble, which could be decomposed within 30 days or so. So that is a main advantage of the Pusa decomposer. So when the stubble itself gets decomposed very quickly because of these fungi strains, so that is a definitely a very good solution to the problem. So these steps you can mention in your way forward. So that is it about this topic. Now we move on to the next one. The next topic is about the Jammu and Kashmir issue, which is a part of your GS syllabus too. So the reason why we are talking about this issue is because the central government has recently notified the changed land laws in Jammu and Kashmir. So earlier, only those people who were the permanent residents of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, they were eligible for buying any property or land in J&K. But now, since the constitutional status of Jammu and Kashmir as a state has been changed in August last year, and it has now been converted into two union territories, Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir and Union Territory of Ladakh. Since then, the government has been taking a number of steps to completely integrate J&K with the rest of India. So one of that now, after the constitutional change that has happened, government had also notified the new domicile rules, about which we have already discussed in previous ICANN videos. So now the government has also notified changes in the land laws. Now it is not just the permanent residents who can own the land in Jammu and Kashmir, even outsiders can also own land. They can also buy land in Jammu and Kashmir. So the main pros and cons of this is, earlier the center was giving the argument that it is because only permanent residents can buy land in J&K and others cannot. That is the main reason why there has been very less amount of investment from the rest of India happening in Jammu and Kashmir. So with less investment coming to Jammu Kashmir because people cannot buy land. So with less investment means less generation of jobs. Less generation of jobs means that there is already a demographic bulge in J&K with a large amount of youth population. When there is less jobs availability, the youth are going to be weaned towards various terrorist activities. They may be engaged in various violent activities. So this is again a threat to the peace and progress of the state. So therefore, the center has given an argument that now that not just the permanent residents but even the others can buy land in Jammu and Kashmir. So it is going to bring in a lot of investment from the private sector into this region. So this investment is going to generate more jobs in the region. It is going to provide more employability to the youth of the region, and they are going to be weaned away from violent activities, and there is going to be long-lasting peace and progress in Jammu and Kashmir. So these are the arguments for the pros of this latest notification of changed land laws by the government. The cons, of course, is that there is going to be a demographic change because if the outsiders are going to come into the region, so they will find Jammu and Kashmir a very good place which has not been explored much before because of various restrictions and various privileges that were available only to the permanent residents. So Jammu and Kashmir has not been explored much by the outsiders. So many of the private people who want to invest there are going to move into the region because now they are able to buy land and invest. So that is going to contribute to a change in the demography in the region. So Jammu and Kashmir has always had that unique cultural identity of Kashmiriyat. So this may be diluted if a lot of outsiders are going to pour their investment in the region and they are going to go and settle down in J&K. So that is going to dilute the unique cultural identity of the region, of which people take a lot of pride in. The third thing is that there is also a strong opposition. So once the last in August 2019, when the constitutional status of Jammu and Kashmir was changed, there was a lot of opposition. Then few months before the domicile rules were notified, then there was a lot of opposition. Again, now for this particular notification of changed land laws, there is still a lot of opposition. So government is taking measures for the progress of Jammu and Kashmir without actually consulting the people of Jammu and Kashmir. So there is a lot of opposition from the people of Jammu and Kashmir against these measures being taken by the government. So this points to a lot of a lack of consulting process, a lack of democratic process in this whole thing, where government is introducing a lot of reforms without the people being consulted or without the people's opinion being taken. So this strong opposition is definitely not good for the state at this point of time. And lastly, it may further lead to further alienation, because people are already opposing the way the constitutional status has been changed, has been diluted, and people are already very anxious about their unique cultural identity being diluted and under threat. So in this such a situation where further such reforms are imposed by the government, it may lead to further alienation of the people, and further alienation of the people is again going to wean them towards again separatism and violent activities in the state. So these are the arguments for cons, that is against the measures by the government. So this was the analysis of the recent notification done by the government on the land laws, where now the land can be purchased, investment in land can be made even by the outsiders, which was earlier limited only to the permanent residents. Now we move on to the next topic. This topic is about the deep fakes, which can be a threat of artificial intelligence. So this artificial intelligence and the various issues related to it is a part of your GS3 syllabus under the science and technologies of broad head. So this whole article is talking about deep fakes. So deep fakes means how, for example, over the digital platforms and media, some person may impersonate as somebody else, or there could be swapping of faces. So like that, through creating such fake profiles and fake images, fake audio clips, fake video clips and all that, how it can lead to a lot of threats in the society. So this is what this whole article is about. So the impact is felt on the individual in the beginning, because an individual, maybe his or her feelings could be hurt, and this might create more violence in the society. And second, it also impacts women the most, because many cases what happens, some pornographic content is displayed and then the face of the woman is swapped to somebody who a person wants to target. So that way the woman will undergo a lot of psychological harm, and they will become a matter of they will just become sexual objects on the digital media or content. So that is how it can be an attack on the woman also. Third is reputation. So if an individual person who has a lot of reputation in the society, that person could be attacked. Any picture or any image of that person could be, any video of that person could be overlapped with some kind of an audio, which makes his speech very inflammatory in nature. So that can cause a lot of harm to the reputation of the individual. So similarly, psychological harm, because some or the other person, sometimes a person will just gather the confidential information about somebody else and start blackmailing that. So the person will be in a lot of will go through a lot of psychological harm, that his or her personal information might just go out there well in the media. So like that, a lot of these are the sufferings that can happen at the individual level because of the deep fakes. The next thing is about the impact on the society. So if any fake video is circulated about somewhere, some dispute that is happening, or some Hindu killing a Muslim, or somebody who is being lynched because somebody killed a cow or something, so that is going to lead to a lot of riots and chaos in the society, because again, these things are fake videos that are not real. They have been doctored videos, so manipulated videos, so that can happen. Similarly, speeches. If some religious head is making a speech, and this video of the speech is doctored and is manipulated as if the person is telling something else, as if the person is telling the members of his religious community to go and attack the people of another religious community, so that speech is again going to be inflammatory and is going to create public disorder, and it's going to harm the social fabric of the country. And also this deep fakes has an impact on the democracy as well, because some politicians may be giving a speech campaigning. Again, the video could be doctored where the politician is telling something else, which can again manipulate the choice of the voters, what they believe in, and the voters' choice of who they should vote will also be changed because of such fake videos and audio clips. So that kind of manipulates the free choice of the voters, and therefore it impacts the democracy as well. It dilutes the democracy in that way. So we see that how deep fakes have an impact on the individual, on the society, on democracy, It also has an impact on the businesses. So deep fakes, which are possible only because of the technology of artificial intelligence. So only because of this that deep fakes are possible today, how the videos can be doctored and how somebody can, some voice overlapping over some already present video can be done. All of this are possible because of technologies advanced like the artificial intelligence, and through this the deep fakes are being created, and how these deep fakes have an impact on the individual, society, businesses, democracy, and so on. So this article also talks about three important way forward that we must keep in mind to tackle with this problem of deep fakes. One is the media literacy. So media must be taught what to be published, what not to be, and people must be taught what to be trusted, what not to be. So they must have a way, people must be media literate, that is they must know which media platform is authentic, which media platform publishes information that may not be authentic. So second is about the meaningful regulations. So definitely media platforms also need to be regulated, and why it should be meaningful is because it should not cross the line of and cross into over regulation, because freedom of media, freedom of press is also very important. So that is why it should be meaningful regulations. And the third is technological solutions. The people at their disposal must have some very easy to use technological solutions through which it must be possible for the users to determine whether some audio, video or anything is fake or is the original and authentic. Based on that, people can also take a decision whether that should be circulated, forwarded, popularized, shared. So that is why these easy to use technological solutions must be available at the disposal of the user, so that user will know whether something is real or fake. So this is about the way forward related to how to tackle deep fakes. So the next topic was about the Gilgit-Baltistan issue, which I said was there in day before yesterday's newspaper, which we were to discuss yesterday. So this whole topic is a part of your post-independence history that you can talk about as part of your GS paper 1. So in that, many times you will have a question like about Gilgit-Baltistan, why, what is the history of it, why was it not integrated into India? So basically this part was under the Maharaja, but however the British presence in that region was definitely there. The British control over this region was more, and when Maharaja acceded to India, so that was when this whole region broke off, and Pakistan started making its control over that area. But however, this was not declared to be a complete another province of Pakistan. The reason for that was Pakistan always wanted to claim the entire Jammu and Kashmir as a part of Pakistan. So it always used to feel that if Pakistan claims just Gilgit-Baltistan as the 5th province, it is almost like saying that only GB is a part of Pakistan, but the rest of Kashmir is not. So that is why it never staked a particular claim on GB to be its 5th province, because it wanted to make a much more stronger and overall claim on the entire J&K. So that is why it didn't claim just a part of GB, so as to ensure that it's how it is taking claim on the entire J&K, that claim remains strong. So but now Pakistan is changing its line of thinking because of various reasons. First, that China has an important presence in the region. Through the GB region, the China-Pakistan economic corridor is also going through. So China wants Pakistan to have good control in the region, so that the region does not remain very disputed or China wants Pakistan to do this so that its CPEC and its investments that is going in that region is very safe. And also because Pakistan wants to disturb India now, because Pakistan was disturbed when India changed the constitutional status of Jammu and Kashmir, and so Pakistan thought that India is tinkering with the situation that was there. So therefore now Pakistan from its side has to give a response to it by declaring that GB is its province. So this is another strategy of Pakistan to deal with India and to respond to India's measure of removing 371 from Kashmir, 370 from Kashmir. So this is another reason why Pakistan wants to do like that. Also, the GB region is a very strategic location because that comes next to the Ladakh, so it is contiguous to Ladakh and also the Xinjiang province of China. So even for China, this is a very strategic location, because if you have some amount of control over this location, then it could be that point from where you can start off if there is any major conflict between China, Pakistan on one hand and India on the other hand. Then this location is strategically important. So that is also the reason why Pakistan and China together want to completely integrate this region so that they can have a good presence in that region. So apart from that, even the people who are inhabiting the GB region, they have a distinct ethnicity, and they are people who are dominated by the Shia population there. So they are ethnically very distinct from the population in the Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So the people in this region, they themselves wanted a much more better integration with Pakistan, because they are ethnically distinct from the Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So these are the various reasons why Pakistan has now planning to declare Gilgit-Baltistan as this province. So this was the analysis that was given in this entire article. So we saw that how initially when Maharaja acceded to India, how this region was taken control of over by the British, and finally it came into the hands of Pakistan. Pakistan started exercising its control, but it was never declared a part of Pakistan because Pakistan was claiming in stake in the entire of Jammu and Kashmir and not just the GB region. So it didn't want to dilute or weaken its own claim, so that's why it wasn't integrating this part into Pakistan. So but now it is doing so because of various reasons. One is China is influencing Pakistan to do so, because China has a lot of investments through CPEC in the region. Several Chinese civilians and the project and all those people who are employed in this region are also already present in this region. So that is one thing. Second is it is a strategic region because it's contiguous to Ladakh region, and it can be a staging post if there were any kind of conflict between Pakistan and China on the one hand and India on the other hand. So it is strategically important. Third, this is ethnically very distinct from the Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So therefore there has been a demand from the people of GB region to integrate with Pakistan. And fourth, Pakistan wants to do this because it wants to give a response to what India did with J&K in last year August by changing its constitutional status. So it created two union territories where center is going to have more control because it is a union territory. So Pakistan wanted to give a response to this. Pakistan always believed that entire Kashmir was belongs to Pakistan, but now because India independently changed the entire status of J&K, so at least from India's side, it means that the issue or the dispute over J&K is long dead, and India has always considered that J&K is an integral part of independent India. So this has weakened Pakistan's claim over entire Jammu and Kashmir. So that is why now it wants to give a response back to India by declaring GB as its province. So these were the reasons why Pakistan has now come out with this plan. So this was a whole analysis about this particular article. This is a question that we'll be taking up today. You should be writing today. Critically analyze the implementation of the Right to Education Act. So any act and its critical analysis about its implementation is a very important topic for your mains answer. And this year, because education is in news due to a number of reasons. So because the national new education policy has come about, and we have the education that has got disrupted because of the pandemic. So due to various reasons, education as a topic has very much been will be given importance this year. So you have to know the implementation about the Right to Education Act, what needs to be done. So this is a 15-marker question to be written in 250 words. So do write your answer, because now we're almost stepping into November. So we have hardly 1.5 months, 2 months before which everything has to be in place and it has to be in your mind so that you can just write on the paper. So do write this. And these were the other articles that weren't really important, or about which we have already discussed in the past. So that's it for today. Thank you.